Hello everyone, and welcome to our again another book discussion by the Council for Global Cooperation. I am Somava Basu, President and founder of the Council for Global Cooperation. Today's book discussion, we are focusing on another book titled G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. G-Man is the first authoritative biography of the FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, written by historian Beverly Gage, published by Viking Press in 2022. And this book is the winner of the 2023 Pulitzer Prize for Biography and the 2023 Bancroft Prize. It is a great honor to have you today with us, Beverly ma'am, and to host your book with our panelists, Professor Mark Atwood Lawrence, and our today's event would be moderated by Professor J. Winter. I would like to pass on the floor to Professor Winter to continue the discussion. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sumava. I want to join you in saluting Beverly Gage, the John Lewis Gaddis Professor of History at Yale, on the achievement of this remarkable book, and also on winning the Bancroft Prize, which has, shall we say, a legendary quality to it. If you look at the names of the people who have come before you, Beverly, it's a great honor to join them. I also wanted to make sure that I recall with pleasure her award of the Sarai Ribicoff Award for Excellence in Teaching at Yale. And Beverly is one of those people whom I knew well at Yale, whose teaching and scholarship were braided together. The choice between one or the other is a false one, and this book shows it. So what I propose we do is to ask Beverly to make an opening statement of whatever length she wants, and then go to Mark Lawrence of the University of Texas for commentary. I have a few things I'd like to say too, because as Beverly knows, we talked through this long period of construction and creation of the book over time, and I'm very happy to be able to add a few remarks at the end after Mark finishes his job. Then we can have additional questions. So Beverly, I'd like to ask you to say a few words of introduction, as much as you'd like.
Great. Well, thanks to Sumava for organizing this, and to Mark and Jay for joining me. I have been in conversation with both of you over the years. Jay, over many, many years. Jay was, I think you were on my dissertation committee a long time ago, during your brief foray at Columbia. And then we were colleagues at Yale. I had many, many Indian food and Thai food lunches where we discussed the fate of poor J. Edgar Hoover. So it's great to be here and to have a chance to talk a little bit about the work that I did. This is a biography that I spent more than a decade working on, off and on. And so I would not call it a labor of love exactly, in the sense that J. Edgar Hoover, as you will hear, is not a person who is beloved either by me or by most historians or most Americans, but it was a labor of love and commitment, in the sense that I really myself found it fascinating from start to finish, to be able to take this sort of deep dive into not only the life of J. Edgar Hoover, but really a pageant of American politics in the 20th century, because he was in the center of so much. So who was J. Edgar Hoover? For those of you who have not yet somehow made your way through my 800-page book, I thought I would just say a few words about that about what drew me to the subject and about some of the themes that the book addresses. The big fact to know about J. Edgar Hoover is that he was the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, for 48 years. So he was there from 1924 through 1972 at the head of the most important federal law enforcement agency in the United States, and also really as the head of its domestic intelligence police. Hoover was in many ways the architect of that institution. When he started out, he was just 29 years old, and it was a kind of tiny little backwater of an institution with a few hundred agents and lots of abuse of power, civil liberties, and corruption problems. He actually came in, to the surprise of many people in our own day, as something of a reformer, someone who promised to clean up and professionalize and build that agency. And over the course of his career, the FBI began to not only acquire new powers, expanded federal law enforcement power in the 1930s, going up against gangsters, starting to carry guns for the first time, and expanded domestic intelligence powers, which I'll talk more about. But it really became an institution that was stamped with Hoover's stamp in ways that were indelible then, and I think are still present in the FBI today. Hoover's political outlook was one of the first things that really intrigued me. I encountered him as a historian for the first time when I was writing my first book, which was a study of a terrorist attack on Wall Street in 1920. It was a relatively unknown event, but it was in the thick of what's known as the first Red Scare, a period of kind of worry about revolution and revolutionary violence in the United States. And there was 24-year-old J. Edgar Hoover already running a little organization called the Radical Division within the Justice Department, which was really the first federal attempt to conduct surveillance of left-wing political radicals in the United States. And what struck me at the time was that even as this very, very young man, a young man with a little bit of power, but not a lot, he was already articulating so many ideas that were going to go on to shape the American century, the 20th century. On the one hand, he was a deep believer in kind of progressive ideas about professional government service, career government service, about the value of expertise and science and white-collar professionalism and nonpartisan service. He was someone who grew up in that tradition and was a believer in it, and in many ways built the FBI around that tradition. And at the same time, he was a deep, deep social conservative already as a young man on matters of race, on matters of religion, and particularly on the two causes that really drove a lot of his career: law and order politics, the fight against crime, and anti-communism, the struggle against the American left. And those pieces were already in place when he was a very young man. And so I thought, wow, so how did he rise to become this figure of such longevity and such influence? And to really take those two sets of ideas and build an institution in their image. So that is really the story that I try to tell in this book. It is, as I said, on the one hand, a biography in the sense that I did try to get to know this man, get to know him as a child and a young man before he became this kind of fearsome household name in the United States, before he became the figure who is on the jacket of the book, which is this sort of jowly older man scowling at everyone. So it is his story, but I also wanted to tell a story about the United States in the 20th century, about the city of Washington, about the ways in which high politics really shaped so many of the social movements, particularly movements for social justice on the ground, from the labor movement to the civil rights movement, how they interacted with a growing surveillance state, and to tell a story that was about the city of Washington and the federal government, which is transformed over the course of this period. J. Edgar Hoover was born in Washington, D.C. in the late 19th century, when it was really just kind of a tiny little southern town. And he was there when he died in 1972, never lived anywhere else, but now lived in a city transformed by the growth of the federal government, the infusion of national and global power in the city of Washington. So there are lots of other details to get into and lots of particular topics to talk about. The book goes through all of the presidents that Hoover served under as FBI director. So that's from Calvin Coolidge up to Richard Nixon, right? A wide variety of characters. It looks at the FBI itself. It gets into the civil rights movement, the labor movement, the anti-war movement, and talks about the FBI as an institution that I think is still somewhat legendary in American popular culture, is also an institution that is currently being attacked and reviled in many quarters of American politics. And so I'm happy to talk a little bit about how the past informs the present as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Beverly. Mark, would you be so kind as to start the conversation?
Sure, it would be my pleasure. I want to start out by saying a big word of thanks to Sumava. As always, I'm really impressed by everything you've managed to accomplish, and not least pulling us all together this morning for this conversation about this really extraordinary book. And thanks to everyone for joining us, and thanks especially to Bev Gage for this incredible book. Truly, I think I said this even before you won all these prizes, one of the most sensational biographies that I've ever read, certainly read in a very, very long time. And it was a pleasure to welcome you to Austin a few months ago for a really memorable talk at the LBJ Library. And I'm glad to have this chance to engage with you for a second time about G-Man. This was a book that jumped out at me for a lot of reasons, very much including, if you'll permit me for a moment, a personal one. My dad, who was born in 1930 and thus was too young for service in the Second World War, won a scholarship in the late 1940s that took him to Washington as a student at George Washington University, and also as what I think we would now call an intern for one of the rapidly growing federal bureaucracies. And as luck would have it, he wound up at the FBI. And though he was very, very junior, had a bird's eye view of none other than J. Edgar Hoover for a very small piece of Hoover's career. And I honestly never had any idea of the connections between George Washington University and all that it represented and the FBI. So I thank Bev for explaining this tiny piece of my family lore. Much more importantly, I thank her for painting such a vivid portrait of a man and an institution that was so much a part of my family history. And I know a lot of other families that were perhaps fascinated by crime fighting drama and, tuned into the FBI television series in the 1970s, or perhaps on the other extreme viewed Hoover as an arch villain of American society. Not many people, I think it's fair to say, had a highly nuanced view of J. Edgar Hoover over many years. And I suspect for many Americans and many people around the world who are only somewhat familiar with Hoover, perhaps just the broad outlines of his career, that lack of nuance, that tendency to see him in really black and white terms remains very, very much the norm. I mentioned my personal connection mostly to make a broader point. G-Man is really an extraordinarily elegant portrait, not just of an individual, but of an era in which all of our lives are situated. And a close reading of this extraordinary book, all 800 pages of it, has much to offer, I think, about the history of the 20th century and even about our own times. And I suspect our conversation this morning might, or this evening, I think, in India, might take us closer to our own day and we might talk about the ways in which Hoover's career and the FBI continues to reverberate in American society these days. Well, I could go on for quite a while about this extraordinary book's many virtues, but let me highlight what I think are four of Professor Gage's most striking achievements in the book. And by the way, as I work through these points, I'll pose a couple of questions that she may or may not wish to take up in a few minutes. The first point I would make, simply by way of laying out the most impressive features of this book, is a really easy one. Simply the writing. This book is such a pleasure to read. It's a doorstop, that's true, 800 and something pages, and it's chock full of detail, but it is a real pleasure to read. And I can't recommend it strongly enough to those in our audience today who haven't yet picked it up. Page by page, it's simply truly engaging. And I think this is no small feat with such a complicated individual, and in a book that covers so much complexity. The second point I would make, by way simply of zeroing in on some of the really extraordinary features of the book, is the source material. The research that underpins this book is, in a word, staggering. The very dense footnotes at the end of the book attest to the depth of that research and also the breadth of that research, by which I mean the number of archives across the United States that Professor Gage drew material from. The research is simply exhaustive, encompassing, I think it's fair to say, not just old sources that have been around for a while, but also the research reflects really pioneering work in newly available sources that Professor Gage has unearthed really for the first time. I'd be interested to hear Bev talk about what she considers to be her most striking or valuable source material that she's using for the first time. The book is perhaps overly modest in some ways about the spade work that went into unearthing some of these extraordinary sources, and I'd love to hear her highlight, what she discovered that really changed the way she thought about Hoover or about his times. And I'd also be interested in kind of turning that question around and posing the reverse question: what material wasn't she able to get her hands on? And are there any sources that are likely to be released in the future that might shed further light on Hoover that she, really wished that she could have gotten a hold of as she wrote her work over the last few years? The third point I'd like to make, again, by way of focusing in on some of the most remarkable features of this book, is to highlight what strikes me, at least, as the balance, the even-handedness that she's able to strike in the book. Now, I certainly wouldn't go so far as to say that balance or even-handedness is always a virtue in historical writing, but it seems extremely important for a biographical subject like Hoover. As I mentioned, as Bev mentioned in her comments, and as G-Man itself certainly shows, Hoover has been extolled at many points as one of the greatest Americans. I mean, this was really one of the most powerful things I took away from the book, how popular Hoover was. And yet at the same time, especially in more recent decades, he's been vilified, right, as one of the real evil figures. I don't think that's too strong a word in American public life. So taking him seriously seems to necessitate steering clear of these kinds of really blunt and extreme judgments and recovering what was, after all, a human being at the heart of this story. And this is precisely what I think Bev Gage manages to accomplish with such impressive results. No question, as she mentioned, there's plenty to dislike about Hoover, especially in the last third of the book, covering his behavior during the Red Scare and especially during the Civil Rights era. But Bev also calls attention to Hoover's genius. That's a word she uses as an administrator, as a bureaucratic operator and survivor. And she paints him at times in a relatively positive light for some of his crime-fighting efforts. To give another example, for his uses of the FBI to suppress white supremacy in the 1960s. That activity, I think she makes clear, never came close to the uses of the FBI on the other side of the civil rights issue. And there's plenty, as I say, to criticize and dislike there. But the real story is a mixed one, as the book makes abundantly clear. The question, I think, that naturally flows here is, how did Professor Gage juggle so many sharply conflicting points of view and manage to produce this, again, I would see it as a kind of fair-minded, balanced biography. And I wonder, in particular, Bev, whether you started out the project with any preconceived notions about Hoover and how your thinking changed as you got further into the topic. How did your understanding of this man changed as you got further into the sources and uncovered all these remarkable complexities that are at the heart of your book? And by the way, it does seem to me that your book now has been out for a while, so I suppose it's fair to ask what sort of responses you've gotten from people who might have been and might in fact still be deeply invested, in one point of view about Hoover or the other. I suspect you've gotten some interesting reactions in your email and in the talks that you've given, no doubt all across the country, if not the world, by this point. So deeply entrenched are attitudes about Hoover that no doubt you've encountered people who want to see him still, in these black and white sorts of ways that he's often been seen, of course, across many, many decades. And then the final really remarkable feature of the book, to me, lies in its ability, as I've suggested and as Bev hit upon in her own comments, to tell the story of its main subject while also setting him so compellingly against the larger history of the 20th century. The book really delivers on the promise in the subtitle to explore the making of the 20th century. And no doubt it's true that all biographers set out for this sort of life and times balance that enables readers to see the principal biographical subject against his or her historical context. But Bev's book, I think, really takes this accomplishment to the next level. The book really stands out for weaving these two elements so seamlessly and artfully. And at the core of her book, I would say, are two contentions that make the lifetimes nexus so powerful in this particular book. First, she shows how Hoover's life ran in parallel with the accumulation of power for the expanding federal bureaucracy. The backdrop of her book is the growth of federal authority and power, and the emphasis on expertise, right? That as she mentioned, went with this growing confidence across, especially the middle decades of the 20th century, in the ability of the federal government to marshal the expertise, the resources, the will, to organize American society and to solve its problems. And yet, second, she shows that Hoover reflected very powerfully one ideological strand that ran very powerfully through this era, this religious and cultural conservatism that was in some ways antagonistic to the rise of an empowered federal bureaucracy rooted in expertise and sort of dispassionate organization of American society, but could make peace with that larger trend when federal power was used to do things like fight crime, combat radicalism, or uphold traditional racial, class, or gender hierarchies. So there's a paradox here in a man who benefited so much from the patronage of liberal state builders, and FDR and Lyndon Johnson certainly stand out here, while espousing at the same time hostility to the principles of expanded opportunity and equality that the New Deal and the Great Society, at least in part, and perhaps in problematic ways, represented. But in this paradox, I think, lies one of the most important insights of the book. The rise of American liberalism in the middle decades of the 20th century could empower people like Hoover, willing to use their influence to limit the application of the liberal principles that were not the only feature of that growing state, but one of the tendencies, let's say, that was closely associated with the expansion of federal power. So the question that arises in my mind from all of this is actually perhaps less about Hoover than about those liberals who cooperated so closely with Hoover and benefited in many ways from his work. And I'm sitting at the moment on the 10th floor of the LBJ Library here in Austin, Texas, an institution that I have the honor to run. So Lyndon Johnson is uppermost in my mind. And Bev says very clearly in her introduction that Lyndon Johnson was one of the people who benefited from and sustained Hoover's career more than anyone else across the long flow of his life. In any case, my question is, to what extent were FDR and LBJ, perhaps others, aware of the trade-offs they were making? And how might our judgments about these liberal giants of the 20th century be altered by a full accounting of Hoover's activities? So, okay, I could go on and on about the things that I really appreciate and admire about this book, but I know there are many others who want to get in on the conversation. So let me wrap up my comments with, well, I guess I've already put out a lot of questions, but let me pose three more questions that are less anchored to specific qualities of the book that I wanted to highlight, and really touch on particular parts of the narrative. And again, perhaps some of this will spark the discussion to follow. The most important one of these questions I want to pose is this one. Hoover is no doubt best known today for his role in the Red Scare of the 1940s and 1950s, when he was often on the front lines of the effort commonly associated with Joe McCarthy to suppress communism. One of the things that impressed me about the book is that Hoover doesn't appear to have thought very deeply or systematically about the history of communism or the reasons why some Americans had been drawn to leftist politics in the 1930s and 40s. And this observation, if I'm right about this, leads me to a question that kind of sat in my head as I was reading the book a few months ago. What's your sense of Hoover's intellectual life and the extent to which he really tried to understand the motives of the people he targeted, whether criminals or communists or activists in later parts of his career, people that he targeted across his career? I don't get the sense, fascinating though Hoover clearly is, of someone who sort of had the capacity to think beyond the cliches and assumptions within which he was so steeped as a young man, and that he never seems to have questioned or challenged in later years. The second of these final three questions I want to pose to you has to do with the McCarthy period in particular. Like a lot of historians who've written about the Red Scare period following the Second World War, you show that there were, in fact, communists at high levels of the U.S. government. I think this is one of the principal and perhaps surprising points that a number of scholars have made now over many, many years. McCarthy, Hoover, and other Red Hunters were, in a certain sense, more correct than commentators and critics have often allowed over the years in seeing some kind of communist danger lurking in American society. And I'm just wondering how your attitude toward Hoover perhaps changed as a result of the recognition that you're very explicit about in the book, that, you know, he had a point at certain moments in ways that his critics weren't always prepared to admit during his lifetime. And then finally, I want to bring us to the subject of Hoover's really fascinating personal life, romantic life, that appeared so sharply at odds with the social conservatism that he espoused, you know, as you show so publicly across his career. As we've long known, Hoover never married or showed much interest in women. Instead, he developed extremely close relationships with a series of men who also worked for the FBI, none more, of course, none more so than Clyde Tolson. And my question for you is, and I think I know the answer here, are you comfortable with the assertion that Hoover was, in fact, a gay man and that he and Tolson were essentially a romantic couple? And how did you reckon with this aspect of Hoover's life as you researched and then wrote the book? And how did you come to the decisions that you clearly arrived at about how to handle this rather delicate subject? To my reading, your analysis is rather brief. It's contained to a few spots in the book, and it's very respectful. And of course, given the potential to turn these issues into something much more explosive, even salacious, I wonder if you could share your thinking about how you came to write about Hoover's personal life in the way that you did. This had to have been a complicated issue that I'm just guessing, sort of debated in your own head at great length before coming to the decisions that you came to. So that's a lot of questions, and I suspect we won't have time for all of them, but others may wish to pick up on some of the things that I've mentioned. But Jay, I'll turn it back over to you, and you can direct traffic from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Very intriguing remarks. Beverly, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Mark, for such a generous and also careful read of the book. I won't try to address absolutely everything that's that came up in those remarks, but I'm happy to talk about any of them that the audience or Jay, you might be interested in getting into. So maybe I'll just say a few words about those last three questions, since those were the ones I think posed most immediately as questions. The first was about Hoover's intellectual life and intellectual capacities. And I would say that you are absolutely right, that Hoover was not an intellectual. And in fact, one of the things that was really striking to me is that I do think he was a man of ideas, certain very particular and very fixed ideas that did drive him. And there's a contradiction of sorts, or at least a combination of factors in which he has this very fixed worldview that's quite consistent at almost every moment of his career. And yet he's also this pretty flexible actor, right? So a lot of his power tends to come in moments of crisis, whether you're talking about, you know, the war on crime of the 1930s, or the crisis of the Second World War, or the early Cold War. And he's able to adapt very, very quickly, right? One of the reasons that he stays in power so long is, in fact, his ability to adapt this very large, by the end, and complex institution to the needs of the moment. So he has these fixed ideas. He's pretty adaptable as a bureaucratic actor, but I think at no moment is he really an intellectual or someone who is trying to, on the subject of communism, really understand what's drawing people to it. Now, he wrote a lot about communism, often ghostwritten by his employees who were quite clear that their primary job was to channel the voice and the worldview of J. Edgar Hoover. And they were able to get it down pretty quickly because it wasn't that complicated and it was quite consistent. But I think he had no real curiosity, certainly no sympathy for, but even as a young man, no real curiosity about the left. He was one of the first people in the federal government to write briefs about the communist parties that formed in the fall of 1919. They are the first kind of federal statements about this. And he talks about Marx and he talks about Lenin. And, he did kind of do research in that sense. But from the beginning, he really just saw this as, a secret criminal conspiracy to undermine everything good and virtuous about the American way of life. And that was it. That was the end of the story, right? And so I think his intellectual capacities in that sense were not what we might think of as being true intellectual curiosity. On McCarthyism and this kind of mid-century moment when Hoover is one of the great anti-communists in the country, I did find myself kind of contending in new ways with evidence that I came to. First of all, evidence that many people at the time saw him as the much more responsible anti-communist than McCarthy. One of my kind of famous moments of bafflement in doing this research was a moment when the famous kind of leftist and civil libertarian I.F. Stone, this muckraking journalist, is looking at the landscape of the early 50s at a moment when Hoover is battling with McCarthy to keep FBI files secret, and is saying, look, we don't want to be defaming, ordinary people with all the nonsense we have in our files, right? I mean, he does say that pretty explicitly. And Stone comes out and says, well, I think J. Edgar Hoover is really the last civil libertarian in Washington, right? Which is a statement that makes almost no sense from our perspective. So that piece really surprised me. And then, as you suggest, Mark, right, there is a lot of evidence that's come out, particularly since the end of the Cold War, that about cases like the Rosenbergs or like Alger Hiss, the FBI was more right, certainly, more correct than the American left would have given him credit for, or than our story of the McCarthy era would have suggested. And so I did try to really contend with that. I tried to be fair about that and give credit where credit was due. And I guess in the end, I came away with two conclusions. One is, on some level, this made a lot of sense. It actually made the story of communism and the Communist Party in the United States more interesting to me, right? To think about a lot of communists as actually quite committed revolutionists, right? And revolutionaries of a sort. And also to really think about one of the things that was fueling the Communist Party, to some degree, a broader left politics, but certainly the Communist Party was this deep affinity for and affiliation with the Soviet Union, right? It's clear from FBI documents that the US Communist Party was taking money from the Soviet Union. In fact, you asked about my favorite files. Some of my favorite files were the files of an operation called Solo, in which the FBI in the late 50s had both the international representative of the US Communist Party and its secret global financial courier on their own payroll, right? So these were two brothers very high up in the Communist Party. One was traveling the world, meeting with, Mao and Khrushchev and Castro, and then the other was funneling all sorts of secret funds from the Soviet government into the United States, doing it by way of the FBI. So he would bring, his $20,000 in unmarked bills. He'd stop off at the bureau, let them look at it all, document it all, and then he would go and pass it along to often to Gus Hall or another American communist figure. So I did try to really contend with that. As I said, I think the two things that I really came away thinking was, one, it actually makes the story of communism and communists and the Communist Party much more interesting than a lot of people think that it is. There was a real secret underground, etc. And then the second is that Hoover himself, in the end, was actually quite responsible for many of the problems that he ran into reputationally, certainly among the left, because in cases like the Rosenbergs, where they had pretty good evidence, they often didn't present that evidence in court or in public because it was more important to them to keep either their informants or their secret programs secret. And so therefore they would come out and say, by God, we know that Julius Rosenberg is guilty, but we can't tell you how, which is not the sort of thing that any self-respecting citizen is going to accept from a government official, and certainly not from an official like J. Edgar Hoover. And I think a lot of the turmoil of that moment is coming out of those politics. Now, it is also true, I want to say, they surveilled a lot of people, harassed, drove out of their jobs and their public lives, people who had nothing to do with espionage, who were people who were not breaking any laws whatsoever, were just civil rights activists, labor activists, etc., who were somewhere in the communist orbit. And the last question that you posed was about Hoover's personal life and whether or not I think that he was gay. And that is actually a complicated question. So first, as a historian, I was pretty committed to sticking to the evidence that we have and not the evidence that we don't have. And we have lots and lots of evidence. In fact, a surprising wealth of evidence about his relationship with Tolson, and particularly about its public aspects, which is to say they really operated as a couple for more than 4 decades together. And they were pretty widely accepted. They had dinners together, they worked together as the 1 and 2 man at the FBI, but they traveled together, they went to Broadway shows together and New York nightclubs, and went on vacation in secret cabanas in California together. I mean, they were a couple. That's who they were. And this was very widely respected and quite open. So we have lots of information about that. And that in itself, I think, was interesting because it's not our image of how a same-sex relationship would have operated at mid-century. On the other hand, there's lots of information we don't. How did they really feel about each other? Were they having sex with each other? And if so, of what sort, right? We simply don't have that information in any detail. I mean, we don't have that information about lots of people, right? But often people say have children, and so you can infer that they were having sex with each other. In any case, so I think that we can't come up with anything very definitive there. I tried to read the most intimate and personal sources that I had available. One great source was Hoover's personal photo albums. He had a lot of his personal papers destroyed when he died, which of course is crushing for a biographer, but his personal photo albums survived, and they're just full of these photos of, beach vacations with Clyde. So, and they're really quite intimate photos, and I tried to read them as evidence, as visual evidence, but also, simply to reproduce at least a few of them in the book to give some sense of that. So there's a little bit that we can do there. And then I will say, further complicating this, they themselves, of course, were adamant in their denials that this was a gay relationship. And they were instrumental in policing the sex lives of other federal employees, because beginning in the 1940s, it was against federal civil service policy to be both homosexual and employed by the federal government. So particularly in the late 40s and 50s, simultaneous with the Red Scare, we had something called the Lavender Scare, in which thousands of federal employees are having their sex lives investigated, and Hoover is often the person doing those investigations. Now, he himself did not make that policy per se, and there's some evidence that he was a little bit less enthusiastic about that than he was about the things that he really cared about, which were communism and crime. Nonetheless, his FBI could be quite vicious toward gay people, and certainly trafficked in all sorts of sexual information about other people. So I think in the end, I didn't, in some sense, try to square the circle. I tried to, introduce some complication to our narrative, which is that there was a period of repression around these questions that lasted up until the late 60s, and then a period of liberation, right? The lived experience of these kinds of questions of sexual identity, sexual power, investigations. They're just more complicated as lived realities than they are in our desire to put them in categories that make sense to us. So I tried to let some of that sit there, all of which is a very long-winded way of saying, yes, I think Hoover was recognizably gay in a way that we would understand whether or not, he ever actually had sex with another man.
Well, thank you, Beverly. Thank you very much. I'd like to pick that up, that last point, try to draw out an alternative interpretation from the one that either you or Mark developed, and that is that what's most important, perhaps at different stages of his life, is what I would call a certain kind of paranoid Christianity. And by that I mean the Presbyterian tradition from which he came. The Presbyterian Church would not have much truck with gay relationships, to be sure, but it has a long history of pointing to hidden sins and to the subversion of society by those who don't follow the Lord's word. I wonder whether, in fact, this is what makes the story so contradictory, that he is the great Weberian, the man of bureaucracy, the man who becomes powerful because of the expansion of state through liberal presidents. But he's also the person who is very sensitive to moral turpitude and to the range of shall we say, threats that exist around us. And, it's Oliver Cromwell who said, great causes have great enemies. And it is a constant moral alertness that allows us to see that the person next to us could really be a devil in disguise. I don't need to use Arthur Miller's words in The Crucible to formulate this. It's pretty well known, but I wonder whether the notion that his moral rectitude is one of the most unpleasant parts of his being, because what it does is to allow him, and this lead me to my second question, allow him to be the agent of purity, when purity is, after all, associated with what America is supposed to be, and communism is dirt. Communism is the ultimate destruction of any notion of morality. Is it the case that he had a deformation of the world that was ultimately religious in origin? And again, I'm not talking theologically. We don't need to see it as an intellectual position, but a position that is learned early by many persecutors in our century and in other centuries, that lead them to believe that they are morally untouchable and everyone else is sinful in the extreme. And the link that I wanted to follow up there in the notion of his racial prejudice, which you admit from the beginning and goes right the way through, and is consistent with very subtle and sensitive alliances for particular reasons at particular times. Is this not also part of a certain kind of what I would call a religious prejudice in American life, if it is the American century? The notion that whiteness is Americanness is so deep that it forms a certain kind of almost South African Presbyterian, Huguenot, Lutheran tradition that has lasted, unfortunately, taking new forms up to our time. So I'd like to ask you whether the origin of his politics may actually have some, in many ways, very simple religious elements that are very powerful and are attractive to very large numbers of people. And the last thing I wanted to say about that attraction, I still feel, maybe less than the two of you, that as real as the communist underground was, that it didn't constitute the threat that he thought it did. That it was there, but it wasn't the devil. In a way, what I see in Hoover is John Milton's devil coming up to threaten the existence of the entirety of Christianity. There's an exaggeration of that communist world that he needed and he played with. Maybe, I want to put it to you, Beverly, consciously, that he knew very well that if he made it more serious than it was, his appropriations would be higher, that he'd get more money and so on. And if that's true, then he is an identifiable Christian politician who uses paranoia and persecution as the basis of his achievement. Would you agree with some of that? What would you say?
I would agree with a lot of that. So first, he comes of age, right? I said so many of his ideas and his basic world outlook is formed in his childhood and in his kind of coming of age years in Washington. And I think you're right that the centrality of the Presbyterian Church of a particular moment, right? A moment that is filled with anxieties about personal sin, but the loss of personal virtue being connected to a loss of national virtue, right? I mean, the progressive era is riddled with these anxieties, and particularly anxieties about a certain kind of masculinity, whether the church is going to be a fighting church moving forward, right? What was termed muscular Christianity in the early 20th century is absolutely the world that forms Hoover, that forms many of his internal anxieties, that informs, I think, many of his anxieties about masculinity and this very, very performative masculinity that he himself not only engages in, but around which he builds the whole bureau. So I think that that's absolutely correct. And that also has implications for his racial ideology, which also forms very early on. I mean, on that front, I think the fact that he grew up in the city of Washington when he did is very critical, because it's a city that's undergoing a very explicit process of racial segregation, right? It was not a city that was especially segregated in the mid-19th and late 19th century, right? It's a city that, compared to a lot of American cities, has a certain amount of racial mobility, intermixture, partly because of federal employment. But during the years that Hoover's growing up, it is segregating. And in fact, during the years that he goes to work at the Library of Congress while he's in college, is precisely the period when federal employment itself is undergoing a much more explicit racial segregation. And so I think this world of Washington is all of a piece to him, right? It really stamps him. The other institution that really interested me on that front was his college fraternity, which was a fraternity called Kappa Alpha. It was an explicitly white Southern fraternity that was infused not only with deeply racist ideas about segregation and the Southern lost cause, but again, infused with this, with the kind of religiosity that you're describing, and infused with a kind of performative masculinity that he's very committed to. So I would agree with a lot of what you have to say. On the question of communism and his vision, I think it's absolutely true that Hoover is, on the one hand, a national security official who is investigating espionage being conducted on American soil by a foreign power, right? So I think any national security official in his position would have done that, and they often did, as Mark and I were saying, a somewhat better job at doing that than they had been previously given credit for. But, right, Hoover doesn't think that that's what anti-communism is, right? I mean, anti-communism is an operatic, existential struggle that touches every aspect of American life, from the grand struggle between godlessness and godliness, right? Between personal virtue and the kind of degradation and uncleanliness that communism is supposed to represent, between democracy and totalitarianism, although, on those questions, J. Edgar Hoover's obviously somewhat complicated character. And so I think really one of the things that makes Hoover so important and so distinctive is that you can imagine a different national security figure and a different national security ethos throughout that whole period of the early Cold War that says, we have a limited mandate. We're looking for people who break the law. We're looking for people who are committing espionage, and we're out to sort of protect the civil liberties of everyone else. And that is not Hoover's position. He's more careful than he's sometimes given credit for, but he is a culture warrior in the extreme. And as you say, in many ways, a kind of paranoid culture warrior, in which his message is they could be everywhere, they could be anywhere, they're secret, they're deceptive, they're not only seeking to topple the government, they're seeking to undermine the American family and all that is right and good. And as a result of this, he becomes something of a hero for the American far right. And it's a kind of funny story because they don't really like federal bureaucrats for the most part, but they love J. Edgar Hoover, and it's because of this kind of culture wars aspect of his identity.
Well, in that sense, would you possibly speculate is the wrong word, but think about the implications for his legacy? Would you say that his bifurcation of the world, quite literally, the division of the world into the children of light and the children of darkness, and the intensity of the war between the two that's ongoing, is just the beginning of the polarization of American society today. It's not only a history. Your book is not only a history of the 50s, although I think it's so strong to me because it was my childhood. I could see and feel the FBI men who interviewed my parents and so on, because the neighbors were suspect.
That was Mark's father going into.
It could have been. Did he wear a little American flag? Did he? Or, I wonder if he did. But in any event, I remember that very well as a 9-year-old boy. The important thing is I hear echoes that are more contemporary, Beverly, in your writing, not 50s. And this mindset of literally slashing the world down the middle and making the as it were, the stakes at issue everything. It's like a roulette game where everything is on the table and the wheel is spinning. That does strike me as a polarized world that perhaps Hoover can be given not credit for, but can be blamed for pushing along towards the very serious divisions that exist today. Would you go along with that?
I would, yeah. I think one of the things that really interested me in writing about Hoover was precisely this question of, his influence on modern conservative politics. And there were a couple of pieces of that. One is that, when I was in graduate school in the 1990s and into the 2000s, there was this whole field of studying of the right, trying to sort of assess conservative traditions, and a lot of that entailed studying sort of grassroots organizations, et cetera, and a lot less of it involved studying actually how the state itself was both engaged in the active repression of the left. And though I think in Hoover's case, with the authority and legitimacy that he had as this state actor, kind of aiding and abetting the rise of groups like the John Birch Society, et cetera. Now, he had a slightly complicated relationship with them, but they viewed him as a hero. And they viewed him as someone who essentially affirmed their worldview, particularly on the communist question, but on many other things as well, that there was this kind of black and white struggle underway, that those who were in opposition to you were not just people who disagreed with you, but were evil and were going to destroy the society at hand. Now, I think it's worth saying that in the 1950s, that kind of anti-communist culture war politics that Hoover was engaged in was pretty popular in the United States, right? I mean, he is getting approval ratings in the 70s, even up to the kind of 90 percentile, right? At the very moment when he is most engaged in that. And part of what happens in the 1960s is that he takes that kind of law and order politics, but particularly that kind of, accusation of kind of fundamental threats to the nation and the social order. And he begins to apply them to groups that actually have a little more currency in the United States, are in fact somewhat more popular, right? Like the civil rights movement, the student left, the anti-war movement. And that's the moment both when I think American politics and our political party system starts to polarize in ways that are much more recognizable in the present, right? The 60s and 70s, the party system really becomes much more ideological and changes in significant ways. And you can see it's also the moment that Hoover's reputation starts to split along those ideological lines, in which he'd been a pretty universally respected figure. I mean, the far left always hated him for obvious reasons. The communists never liked him, and a lot of progressives didn't. But that was a pretty small set of voices for a period of time. And in the 60s, liberals and leftists really come to dislike Hoover, partly because the FBI is committing some of its worst civil liberties abuses against figures like Martin Luther King, et cetera. But those are movements that have a little more traction in American life. And, conservatives still love him for that kind of vengeful politics. But Democrats, liberals, leftists are really starting to revile Hoover and push back against him.
I think the other really striking interpretation, I don't know if you'd agree with this, Mark, in the book that surprised me is Harry Truman's distaste for him. That the FDR linkage is very strong in your interpretation. And then this little man from Missouri comes along, and he says, not only do I not like you, I don't want you to have foreign intelligence responsibilities as well. I'm going to do something totally different.
Is the one great bureaucratic defeat of Hoover's career is when he goes and he'd been having these conversations with Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt honestly seems to have been entertaining the idea, but then he dies. And Hoover goes to Harry Truman and saying, now that the war is ending, I should be not only the domestic intelligence chief, but I should also be a global intelligence chief. And Truman says, I don't think so. That's where we get the CIA, right? Which is also a kind of interesting set of institutional distinctions in the United States. but it really comes out of those interpersonal as well as political struggles in a very particular moment.
Well, it may be that Truman actually understood the nature of his paranoia. Give this man foreign intelligence and domestic intelligence together, there's no telling what damage he could cause. There's no argument for the CIA, but the claim I'd put is that there is a very interesting blip in the onward and upward rise of J. Edgar Hoover, and it's Truman saying, no, we're not going to go that way. And this is one of the, I think, one of those striking moments, dramatic moments that you have made vivid in your book. Mark, do you agree with that? That Truman is a very unusual player in this game?
I do. I was really struck by that section. I honestly didn't know that story, so it's it's an important building block for sort of understanding the National Security Act and the origins of the CIA and so forth. But the way I might approach this question would be to to suggest that there's this feeling of sort of, almost inevitability around J. Edgar Hoover. He was in office for so long and seemed such a commanding presence. And explaining that durability is one of the major challenges around Hoover, I think. And yet, one of the things I picked up from Bev's book is that there were moments, right, where his power was perhaps threatened or he suffered a defeat, especially in connection with the CIA. And I don't know if we have time for this. I see Sumava has his hand up, but one question I think I would pose that might get a little bit at some of the broader contours of Hoover's career in a backhanded sort of way is, what were the moments when he could have lost power? What were the weaknesses that, if we think sort of counterfactually, might, given a slightly different set of circumstances, have brought him down and made him less of a kind of perpetual presence and inevitability in American life? I think that moment in the late 40s might be, I don't know if the controversy over the CIA ever really threatened his job at the FBI, but still it was a moment of setback. Or were there others like that? And what do those moments reveal about Hoover?
Mm-hmm. Well, there were those moments, right? And so I agree that one of the things that I wanted to do in the book was to get away from this sense of inevitability, right? That this was all going to unfold. The institution we have was always the institution that was going to be made. Hoover was always going to last because, of course, when he started out as a young man, it was a very uncertain story, and it takes a long time for that institution to grow and for him to have anything that we would really recognize as significant power. So there are lots of moments. He could have been stopped before he even started. There's a very young man orchestrating the Palmer raids, and which were these very controversial deportation raids aimed at anarchists and communists in 1919 and 1920. He could have been pushed out at that moment in the scandals of the Harding era. I'll mention two others that I think are sort of interesting. So he believed, and the moment that he came, I think, closest to actually submitting his resignation was in 1940, when he had, at Franklin Roosevelt's direction, right, the US is not in the war, but the war is on in Europe. And so he's been charged with conducting domestic intelligence in the United States. And he very happily gears up and says, I'm creating a surveillance index file for all subversives in the United States. And that meant on the left as well as the right. And there's actually a big pushback against this and saying, this isn't the way we want our war effort to go, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a moment that he seems really vulnerable. He says that he might resign. And then kind of Franklin Roosevelt comes in, by mid-1940, the war in Europe is looking much more dire. Franklin Roosevelt comes in and says, okay, enough of this controversy and enough of this nonsense. We need you to get to work. We need you to build up this apparatus, right? Franklin Roosevelt is not a civil libertarian. And so that moment passes, but it's a moment that Hoover remembered for a long time as a moment of deep vulnerability. And then the other one that comes to mind is sort of right before his death, when he is seeming old and vulnerable, and Nixon is annoyed with him, and Nixon actually sits down with him and tries to get him to leave office. And Hoover says, I don't want to. And Nixon says, well, okay, then I guess I won't make you do it, right? Which was a real testimony to Hoover's power in that moment. And ironically, though they were extremely good friends, Nixon is the only president who seems to have even attempted, in any explicit way to get Hoover out of his job.
Sumavu, I think you have a question.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question, and this is related to the foreign intervention part. We discussed about a lot of domestic politics in terms of Hoover's role in domestic politics. So, ma'am, if it would be really great if you could also enlighten our audiences in the controversial tactics that Hoover played, such as the COINTELPRO. And we also come across events where we come to know that Hoover had been instrumental in eradicating communists in Latin America and OAS states. So if you could brief us on that, if you had come across such, and also we discussed about the global espionage plan, which some believe that Hoover wanted to create an American Gestapo like Nazi Germany. So why didn't it succeed? If you could also highlight, ma'am.
Yeah, great. So the FBI was primarily a domestic organization, to some degree to Hoover's frustration, as we were saying. Hoover's argument actually for why the FBI ought to also become something like the CIA, which was not a terrible argument on some level, although we certainly wouldn't have wanted that to happen, was that actually during the Cold War, kind of domestic politics and global politics were going to be so intertwined that it didn't make sense to have more than one agency that wasn't going to be talking. So that's particularly true on the question of communism. But as time went along, on a whole host of revolutionary movements that are happening around the world, which Hoover often saw as being connected to domestic movements, right? So the New Left and Vietnam and Cuba, right? I mean, the idea that the United States is going to have exiles from other revolutionary movements around the world. He saw all of these things as intertwined, which of course they were on some level, though we would not have wanted J. Edgar Hoover doing a whole lot. There are some ways in which the FBI was more explicitly charged with and sought out various forms of international jurisdiction. So one is that during the Second World War, the FBI was given jurisdiction over espionage and subversion in Latin America. So the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA, is off in the Asia, Europe, the theaters of war. But the FBI sets up offices throughout Latin America, South America, primarily for surveillance of Nazi and communist organizations, movements, affiliations, etc. So it's not a huge operation. I mean, it's several hundred agents by the end. And when Truman says you're not going to be the CIA, the FBI has to shut down that whole operation. Hoover is furious. He pulls everyone out. They burn their files, right? They destroy their offices. They burn their files so that the CIA won't get them. But that was a moment in which they were actually expanding and thought they would continue to expand. The FBI also maintained various offices, and still does in many cities around the world, for the purpose of kind of criminal extradition, for the purpose of doing various forms of global law enforcement, as well as to some degree espionage and counter-espionage, though often those are much more explicitly charged with law enforcement. I think the most important thing actually that happened during Hoover's years was through the FBI Academy and through Quantico, which is where FBI training happens. We associate that mostly with, that's the place that young agents go to be trained, but the FBI also operates an academy both for domestic police officers and police officials, and for police and intelligence officials around the world who come in and are trained in FBI techniques and FBI methods. And so there, I think, and I didn't write very much about this because in a biography, it didn't, I had to kind of make certain choices about how to limit the story. But I think there's really a fascinating tale yet to be written about the FBI's training of particularly intelligence officials, but also police officials, and police officials who are charged around the world with, the suppression of political movements, as well as with criminal law enforcement, being trained at the FBI, and then going out and becoming part of this kind of global surveillance network.
Beverly, on that point, are you suggesting that the FBI was either aware of or part of the rat lines that got Nazis into South America? Because if they're surveying fascists, they're surveying the new faces that wind up alongside the old fascists who are there. Is there any, shall we say, smell of evidence? I understand a lot of it just went up in flames, but right. Is this a possibility that the FBI was involved in the escape of people who were very knowledgeable about communists? They had been killing them for many years.
It's certainly possible. I mean, I would say the FBI was often the junior player to both the Army, the military writ large, and the OSS in these kinds of operations, both toward the end and then during the war. But they were certainly there, right? Things like Operation Paperclip, right, when you're bringing Nazi scientists into the U.S., but other operations as well. Certainly, they are there. It is entirely plausible that they are playing one role or another, although they do they're forced to pull out of South America pretty quickly after the war. So by about mid-1946, again, they're burning their files and getting out. So I would say, they were there. They probably knew quite a lot about it and may have been involved, but my sense is that they were not really the chief players, but it'd be interesting to see evidence.
Mark, you've been patiently waiting. I want to give you a chance to ask a further question if you so choose.
Thanks, Jay. I don't want to take the spotlight away from anyone in our audience who would care to pose a question, but Bev, I'll just circle back to a couple of the things that I tossed out there at the beginning of my comment. I wonder if you could talk about any materials that you wish you had been able to see that might be forthcoming in the years to come. And then second, if you'd care to talk about it, I'd be very curious to know what kind of response you've gotten. I mean, obviously your book has won all these incredibly well-deserved awards and has been treated with such respect in the academic community, but you're obviously touching a lot of themes here that matter a whole lot to a lot of folks out there who might have really interesting responses to your book.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the source question, I'd say two things. One is that in kind of 2018 or thereabouts, there was a huge release of documents, primarily from the Church Committee, which was this investigative committee that looked into not only the FBI, but the CIA and the NSA and the whole intelligence community in the mid-1970s. And we've had their reports and their hearings for a long time, but these were sort of the raw research files. And they're so voluminous. I made use of a lot of them that I could get through, looking at COINTELPRO and looking at the King files and such. But there's a lot more in there that I am hoping that other researchers can get through over the years, because it's just, you know, hundreds of thousands of pages, if not millions of pages of documents that were just kind of put out into the world, and that people are going to have to go through in patient ways. I would say the most controversial thing that is likely to come out has to do with Martin Luther King, which is to say that the FBI, as part of its surveillance and harassment campaign against King, starting in 1964, was bugging his hotel rooms. And what they were doing was documenting his sex life, and he had a rather expansive extramarital sex life while he was on the road, which was most of the time, actually, as well as in Atlanta. So there's a lot there about King's sex life, but those tapes and the transcripts of them have been sort of embargoed under court order since 1977. And they are due to be released in 2027. And I think, you know, there's a real potential for that release to go a lot of different ways. So as a historian and as someone who's been so immersed in this, you know, I am somewhat curious to see what's actually there. But I think it's a pretty combustible set of documents and recordings. So that is yet to come. I would say my main frustration really in working with FBI files is are just redactions. So even though I don't think the FBI is super protective in a reputational sense of files from the Hoover era, the bureaucracy takes a long time, and then sometimes when you get those files, there are vast swaths of them that are still redacted. And so there were lots and lots of frustrations on that front, where you couldn't quite tell what was happening because of the nature of the FBI documents. In terms of the response, you know, the response that's come to me has mostly been very heartening. I will say, in doing this, I was concerned, first of all, that the world doesn't want 800-page history books anymore, and also that that people would have such fixed ideas about Hoover that, you know, they wouldn't really be ready to or want to engage a book like this. But I actually haven't found that to be true. There's been, you know, I think lots of flexibility. So even, you know, people on the left who experienced the FBI's repression and grew up as deep Hoover haters, I think have come to this as a book really that's trying to explain power and explain how we got to a moment in our history where those sorts of things could have been happening. I don't think there are a lot of people out there who are still very committed to a purely heroic view of J. Edgar Hoover. But I think there has been, you know, from what I can tell, so among ex-agents groups, that sort of thing, there's been a lot of back and forth. I haven't been privy to all of it. And I would say, you know, politically, it's been interesting to see what it is that people take away from the book. And there are figures on the left, right? Congressman Jamie Raskin, who is a very progressive Democrat, has kind of talked about the book and lessons from the book. But Vivek Ramaswamy, right, who is a kind of far-right Trump rival in the, he's not going to be a successful Trump rival, I think, but nonetheless is trying to kind of out-Trump Trump these days, has also said that, you know, he's read the book and it shows why we should abolish the FBI. So, you know, people across the spectrum, I think, are reading the book and, you know, taking different messages from it. And I think that that's fundamentally good. I mean, once you've put the baby out into the world, you know, it's gonna have a life of its own.
Yes, it will. Well, Beverly, you should certainly have the last word. What's next? Where are you headed?
What's
Yeah,
next?
yeah.
Well, next I'm writing a short book. Having spent so long in the archives, I'm writing a short book that is, I'm calling it a road trip through US history, but it's in anticipation of 2026, which is going to be the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence of the American founding. And so it's a study of how Americans are contending with history at this moment through historic sites. So it's kind of all of American history in a very short volume, with me in my car going around finding it on the ground. But I would say the next big archive project is going to be about Ronald Reagan, which in some ways I view as kind of a sequel to the story of Hoover, because I think of this struggle over communism and anti-communism really as the, or at least one of the chief structuring forces of 20th century politics that made the 20th century, a century that we can make some sense of now as a historical period. And Hoover only got me to the early 70s, but Ronald Reagan is kind of going to get me to the end of that story. And like Hoover is someone who has, this enormous life expanse. And so I'm plunging into Ronald Reagan.
Well, thank you very much, Beverly Gage, for doing a tour d'horizon of a remarkable book. Congratulations once again on the book, and thank you, Mark Lawrence, for probing it so sensitively and positively, and Sumava Basu. Many thanks for providing the framework within which this important book can be made known to others. This conversation will be recorded and will be available. We will be able to provide that to those who wish. Thank you once again, Beverly Gage, and congratulations.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much.
Thank you.